Mid-1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched wide and empty, a vast battleground between two empires locked in a brutal fight. The Battle of Midway had just ended, its smoke still hanging over the sea. For Japanese carriers lay at the bottom of the ocean, along with hundreds of planes and their best naval aviators. For Japan, this was a staggering blow. Their carrier strike force had been the spearhead of their expansion across the Pacific. Now, much of it was gone. In the days after the battle, Japanese pilots and officers believed the Americans had taken losses almost as bad as theirs. They assumed it would take the United States months to recover, just as it would have for Japan. This was how war had always worked for them. Aircraft were complex machines, built carefully and slowly by skilled workers. Pilots needed years of training. A destroyed carrier was a loss that could not be undone quickly. Japan's military leaders' thought time was on their side. If they could regroup and strike again before the Americans rebuilt, they might still control the Pacific. But events did not unfold the way they expected. At Pearl Harbor and on small island bases across the Pacific, Japanese reconnaissance pilots began noticing something strange. Within days of Midway, fresh squadrons of American aircraft appeared. New fighters and bombers sat on runways. Ships at sea reported seeing carriers once thought crippled now fully operational again. At first, Japanese pilots thought they were mistaken. Perhaps these were older planes pulled out of storage, or survivors patched together from damaged parts. Yet the numbers kept growing. Each day brought more aircraft, more pilots, and more fuel for battle. The truth was that America's industrial system worked in a way Japan had never encountered. In California, Washington, and other states along the West Coast, massive factories ran day and night. They produced aircraft in quantities that seemed impossible. At plants like Grumman on Long Island or Douglas in California, assembly lines turned out planes the same way car factories once made automobiles. Workers stood in shifts around the clock, each responsible for one small step. Instead of crafting each plane by hand, they built them in pieces and moved them down the line. Standardized designs meant parts could be swapped easily, and thousands of identical machines could be built at once. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan became a symbol of this new kind of production. Could produce a B-24 bomber every hour. On the West Coast, similar systems built fighters like the F-4F Wildcat and dive bombers like the SBD Dauntless in huge numbers. In 1942 alone, the United States produced more than 47,000 aircraft. Japan produced barely a tenth of that. Logistics supported this surge. America had fleets of cargo ships, like the Liberty ships, built quickly and cheaply to move supplies across the ocean. Spare parts were shipped in bulk to forward bases. Some planes were sent partially assembled, finished by crews closer to the front. This meant new aircraft could reach combat zones within days instead of weeks. Pilots could fly replacements straight into battle while mechanics prepared the next wave. The Japanese military was unprepared for this pace. Their own factories were smaller and relied on skilled craftsmen. Production was slower and less flexible. Training new pilots took years. When a veteran pilot was lost, his place could not be filled quickly. Japan entered the war with a corps of elite aviators, but each battle reduced their numbers. By contrast, the United States ran massive training programs to turn out new pilots as fast as factories turned out planes. These young men arrived in combat already matched to the aircraft waiting for them. On the battlefield, the difference was dramatic. Japanese pilots flew missions expecting weakened opposition. After Midway, they believed they had dealt a serious blow. But when they reached American bases, they were met by squadrons that seemed untouched by losses. In some cases, Japanese pilots faced aircraft types they had never seen before, like the TBF Avenger torpedo bomber. Reports filtered back to Japanese commanders describing a steady stream of fresh planes appearing almost overnight. Confusion turned to unease as the scale of America's resources became clear. There are accounts from Japanese pilots who described the moment they realized what they were facing. One wrote that after his unit destroyed several enemy planes in a raid, they returned the next day to find the same airfield fully stocked again. It was as if the Americans had endless planes, he noted in his diary. Another recalled seeing replacement carriers arrive so quickly that it seemed the Americans were building them at sea. For the Americans, this flow of equipment gave confidence. A pilot who lost his plane knew another waited for him. Mechanics had ample parts and tools. Commanders could plan offensives without fear of running out of machines. This safety net allowed the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps to take risks Japan could not afford. Even when they lost planes, they could keep pressing forward. The Japanese reaction shifted from disbelief to despair. Their commanders had counted on attrition, hoping to wear down the Americans through repeated battles. Instead, they saw that every plane they destroyed was replaced almost immediately. Their own ranks, meanwhile, grew thinner. Each lost pilot represented months of training and experience that could never be recovered in time. Battles that once seemed evenly matched now tilted against them. The Guadalcanal campaign showed this most clearly. As fighting dragged on, the Americans kept sending fresh planes and reinforcements. Japanese units were forced to ration fuel and conserve aircraft. Pilots who survived missions flew again and again without rest, knowing there were no replacements coming. Over time, the imbalance became impossible to hide. Japanese pilots entered combat already knowing they were outnumbered. The sky over the Pacific shifted from contested territory to one increasingly dominated by American aircraft. Factories across the United States roared to life after the attack on Pearl Harbor. President Franklin D. Roosevelt had already called the nation the arsenal of democracy. And by mid-1942 that phrase had become reality. The country mobilized its entire economy for war. Civilian industries were converted to produce military equipment, and production plants ran without pause, day and night. There were no weekends off, no slow periods. 3 shifts of workers rotated around the clock so that machines never stopped moving. Aircraft factories became the heart of this effort. Companies like Grumman, Boeing, and Douglas expanded at a pace no one had seen before. Boeing's plants in Seattle built bombers with lines of workers stretching the length of city blocks. Grumman, on Long Island, was known for producing the rugged fighters flown by the Navy and Marine Corps. Douglas in California became a hub for carrier aircraft, with assembly lines producing dive bombers like the SBD Dauntless. Each factory specialized, but all shared the same goal: speed. The focus was on building as many planes as possible, as quickly as possible, while keeping quality high enough for combat use. To meet these demands, the factories adopted methods first developed by the automobile industry. Instead of building each plane from start to finish in one place, work was divided into steps. One group of workers built wings. Another focused only on engines. Others handled fuselages or tail sections. As these parts were completed, they moved down a line where they were fitted together like pieces of a puzzle. This approach cut production time dramatically. It also meant workers did not need years of specialized training. A man or woman could be taught a single task and then repeat it with precision. Ford's Willow Run plant in Michigan became the best-known example of this system. Before the war, it had produced cars. By 1942, it was turning out B-24 Liberator bombers. These were massive 4-engine aircraft used for long-range missions over the Pacific and Europe. The plant was so efficient that by the end of the year, it could produce 1 bomber every 63 minutes. The sight of bombers rolling off an assembly line like automobiles shocked foreign observers. For Japan, whose aircraft were still built in smaller facilities by skilled craftsmen, the difference was staggering. The numbers told the story. By 1943, the United States was producing more than 6,000 aircraft every month. In comparison, Japan's total production hovered around 600 fighters per month, with far fewer bombers. This meant the Americans were outproducing the Japanese by a factor of 10. Every time a plane was lost in combat, there was another ready to take its place. The Japanese could not match this rate. Each plane they lost represented a serious blow to their limited resources. Building the aircraft was only part of the challenge. They also had to be delivered thousands of miles to the Pacific front. The United States developed a vast logistical network to make this possible. Cargo ships known as Liberty ships were built in enormous numbers to carry equipment, fuel, and supplies. These ships were designed to be simple and fast to construct. Entire hull sections were prefabricated and welded together, a process that allowed a single shipyard to launch a new vessel in just a few weeks. Once loaded, these ships sailed in convoys, protected by Navy escorts, to bases across the Pacific. The Americans planned carefully to keep this supply line running smoothly. Spare parts were shipped alongside the aircraft so that maintenance crews had everything they needed. Engines, propellers, and landing gear were sent in crates, ready to be swapped out when a plane was damaged. In some cases, aircraft were shipped partially assembled to save space. They were then finished at bases closer to the fighting, where they could be made combat-ready in a matter of days. This approach reduced downtime and ensured that new planes reached the front quickly. On islands like Guadalcanal or Espiritu Santo, forward repair depots sprang up almost overnight. These depots functioned like mini-factories, staffed by mechanics and engineers who could rebuild planes on site. A damaged fighter could land in the morning and return to combat the next day, fully repaired. When losses occurred, replacement planes were flown in almost immediately. This created a constant flow of fresh equipment to American squadrons, something the Japanese pilots could hardly believe. The sheer scale of this operation was visible to anyone who visited a West Coast port or airfield. Endless rows of crated engines waited on docks. Stacks of wings and fuselages filled warehouses. Trains carried completed aircraft across the country to ports, where cranes loaded them onto cargo ships. Even before a battle ended, replacement planes were already on their way. Japan's system was completely different. Their aircraft production relied heavily on small teams of master craftsmen who built planes by hand. Each aircraft required careful attention to detail and took much longer to complete. There was pride in this work, but it came at the cost of speed. Japanese factories could not simply switch to mass production. Their industrial base lacked the infrastructure, machinery, and labor force needed for large-scale output. Their supply chain was also vulnerable. Japan depended on shipping lanes that were increasingly targeted by American submarines. Even when new planes were built, getting them to frontline units became harder as the war went on. Spare parts were often scarce, forcing mechanics to cannibalize damaged planes just to keep a few flying. The contrast grew sharper as the war continued. American pilots received new aircraft models while still training on older ones. For example, as the Grumman F-4F Wildcat began to show its limits, the improved F-6F Hellcat was already rolling off production lines. Squadrons could transition to the newer planes seamlessly because there were enough machines to equip entire units at once. This flexibility gave the U.S. Navy an edge not just in numbers but also in technology. Japanese pilots began to notice this difference in the skies. After a fierce battle, they expected their opponents to weaken. Instead, they encountered fresh planes and rested crews. Reports back to Japanese headquarters described the impossible. American squadrons seemed to grow stronger no matter how many were shot down. The numbers were so overwhelming that some Japanese officers refused to believe them at first. But the reality was plain to see. America's factories and logistics had turned the tide of the war before many battles were even fought. The Battle of Midway left the Japanese Navy reeling. 4 of its frontline carriers lay sunk, along with hundreds of planes and some of their most experienced pilots. But in the days following the battle, Japanese commanders tried to convince themselves that the damage had been evenly matched. Their intelligence officers reported heavy losses on the American side. They believed at least 2 American carriers had been sunk and the others badly damaged. To the Japanese, this meant the Americans would need months to recover. That was the rhythm of their own war machine. If Japan lost a carrier, it would take years to replace it. When they lost planes, production slowed because each one had to be built carefully by skilled workers. Pilots were trained for years before being considered combat-ready. War, for them, was a slow grind of resources and preparation. So they assumed their enemy followed the same timeline. In the week after Midway, Japanese pilots took to the skies expecting little opposition. They flew reconnaissance missions over Pacific islands and shipping lanes, confident they would find empty skies and weakened fleets. But what they saw instead unsettled them. On islands like Midway, Pearl Harbor, and others nearby, fresh squadrons of American planes sat lined up on runways. Wildcat fighters gleamed in the sun, their fuselages painted and ready for battle. Dauntless dive bombers and Avenger torpedo bombers were parked in neat rows, their engines being checked by ground crews. At first, the Japanese pilots thought they were seeing survivors brought together from scattered units. That seemed possible. Perhaps the Americans had gathered damaged planes and repaired them quickly. But as more reconnaissance flights were launched, the reports grew consistent. Each day there were more planes, more pilots, and more activity. Entire squadrons appeared where none had been before. On the sea, the picture was no less shocking. Japanese submarines shadowed American carrier groups, expecting to find crippled ships limping back to port. Instead, they saw carriers operating at full strength, launching planes as if Midway had never happened. To the Japanese Navy, this seemed impossible. No nation could replace carriers and aircraft so quickly, at least no nation they had ever fought before. The reality was that American factories had already replaced much of what was lost. While Japanese planners still studied maps and waited for their next shipment of aircraft, the Americans were moving replacements into position. From California and Washington state, new planes were loaded onto transport ships or flown island by island toward the front. Mechanics assembled them at forward bases, sometimes finishing the final steps of construction just hours before combat missions. Japanese pilots began to sense this difference during their first encounters after Midway. In dogfights over the Pacific, they faced opponents flying planes that looked brand new. Fresh paint and undamaged fuselages marked aircraft that had not been through weeks of combat. Even more alarming, some of these planes were improved designs the Japanese had never seen before. The Grumman F-6F Hellcat was one such aircraft. Its arrival was sudden and seemed almost magical to those on the other side. It was faster, tougher, and more heavily armed than the older Wildcat fighter. Japanese aces who had dominated early battles suddenly found themselves outmatched. In some cases, they reported facing formations of these new planes only days after first hearing rumors of their existence. To them, it felt as though the Americans were creating aircraft out of thin air. This had a direct effect on morale. Japanese pilots entered missions believing they would fight a weakened enemy, only to face opponents who seemed to grow stronger each week. After a raid, when they destroyed a number of American planes on the ground, they expected to return later and find the airfield crippled. Instead, when they came back, they were met by even larger groups of fighters ready to take off. Mid-1942, the Pacific Ocean stretched wide and empty, a vast battleground between two empires locked in a brutal fight. The Battle of Midway had just ended, its smoke still hanging over the sea. For Japanese carriers lay at the bottom of the ocean, along with hundreds of planes and their best naval aviators. For Japan, this was a staggering blow. Their carrier strike force had been the spearhead of their expansion across the Pacific. Now, much of it was gone. In the days after the battle, Japanese pilots and officers believed the Americans had taken losses almost as bad as theirs. They assumed it would take the United States months to recover, just as it would have for Japan. This was how war had always worked for them. Aircraft were complex machines, built carefully and slowly by skilled workers. Pilots needed years of training. A destroyed carrier was a loss that could not be undone quickly. Japan's military leaders' thought time was on their side. If they could regroup and strike again before the Americans rebuilt, they might still control the Pacific. But events did not unfold the way they expected. At Pearl Harbor and on small island bases across the Pacific, Japanese reconnaissance pilots began noticing something strange. Within days of Midway, fresh squadrons of American aircraft appeared. New fighters and bombers sat on runways. Ships at sea reported seeing carriers once thought crippled now fully operational again. At first, Japanese pilots thought they were mistaken. Perhaps these were older planes pulled out of storage, or survivors patched together from damaged parts. Yet the numbers kept growing. Each day brought more aircraft, more pilots, and more fuel for battle. The truth was that America's industrial system worked in a way Japan had never encountered. In California, Washington, and other states along the West Coast, massive factories ran day and night. They produced aircraft in quantities that seemed impossible. At plants like Grumman on Long Island or Douglas in California, assembly lines turned out planes the same way car factories once made automobiles. Workers stood in shifts around the clock, each responsible for one small step. Instead of crafting each plane by hand, they built them in pieces and moved them down the line. Standardized designs meant parts could be swapped easily, and thousands of identical machines could be. The Japanese pilots had entered the war with pride and confidence. They were among the best-trained aviators in the world, flying machines built with care and precision. In the early months of the conflict, they had dominated the skies, cutting through American and British planes with skill and discipline. Victories came quickly, and many believed Japan's air power was unmatched. After Midway, that confidence began to fracture. At first, the pilots did not understand what they were seeing. When they destroyed an American airfield or sank a ship, they expected those losses to matter. That was the logic of war as they knew it. It was how things worked in Japan. Each plane lost was a serious setback. Every pilot killed represented years of training that could not easily be replaced. But the Americans did not fight by those rules. Each time the Japanese inflicted damage, new planes appeared almost immediately. When a squadron of fighters was destroyed, another took its place within days. Pilots who expected to weaken the enemy through steady attrition instead faced fresh opposition that seemed to grow stronger as the months passed. This created confusion at first. Many thought they were seeing the same planes over and over, repaired and returned to service. Others believed the Americans were simply concentrating their forces, moving aircraft from one region to another. But as the pattern continued, disbelief set in. In later years, some Japanese pilots wrote about this feeling in their diaries. One aviator recalled a raid in which his unit burned dozens of American planes on the ground. They returned the next morning expecting to finish the job, only to find the airfield full again. For every plane we destroyed, 2 more appeared the next day, he wrote. Another pilot described it as fighting a wave that never stopped coming. No matter how hard they struck, the tide rose higher. Over time, disbelief turned to despair. Pilots began to realize they were fighting a nation with resources beyond their comprehension. In Japan, factories were small and specialized. Planes were built by skilled craftsmen who took pride in every detail. Each machine was unique in some way, a product of careful human labor. It was a source of national pride but also a weakness. When those planes were lost, replacements took time. The Americans did things differently. Their planes rolled off assembly lines like cars. They were identical, interchangeable, and built in staggering numbers. The Japanese pilots saw this difference firsthand. After a battle, they examined wreckage from American planes and were struck by the uniformity of parts and construction. Everything was standardized, from the bolts to the engines. To them, it felt impersonal, even crude. Yet it allowed the Americans to replace losses almost instantly. This clash of approaches extended beyond factories. It shaped the mindset of the people fighting the war. Japanese pilots saw themselves as craftsmen too, in a way. Their skill was honed through years of training and discipline. They believed mastery came from experience and precision. The Americans trained pilots quickly and sent them into battle in large groups. To Japanese eyes, this seemed reckless. But the Americans could afford to take risks because there were always more pilots and more planes waiting behind them. On the battlefield, this difference was clear. Japanese aviators flew with a sense of personal responsibility. They knew their planes and their lives were precious resources. Losing either was a blow their country could not easily recover from. American pilots, by contrast, fought aggressively, knowing replacements were ready. This gave them a boldness that unsettled their opponents. They attacked with confidence, swarming targets even when losses were certain. The emotional impact of this imbalance was profound. Japanese pilots began to feel trapped in a fight they could not win. Each mission became more dangerous as their numbers dwindled. Veterans were forced to fly again and again without rest, their exhaustion deepening with each sortie. When one of them was killed, his absence was keenly felt. There was rarely anyone ready to take his place. Some Japanese pilots hid their despair, writing only after the war about how hopeless it had felt. Others spoke quietly among themselves, sharing doubts they could not voice to superiors. The official line remained one of courage and determination, but beneath the surface, morale was crumbling. On the American side, the mood was very different. Pilots knew that if they lost a plane, another would be waiting. This knowledge gave them strength. They could fly with less fear, push harder, and recover faster from defeat. Even when battles were costly, they believed victory was inevitable because their resources seemed endless. Back home, industrial workers felt connected to the war in a direct way. They built the planes, engines, and ships that sustained the fight. Many had family members serving overseas, and they saw their labor as part of the same struggle. The speed and scale of production became a source of pride. Each new aircraft rolling off the line represented not just a machine, but a lifeline for those at the front. This connection fueled morale on both sides of the ocean. In American factories, posters urged workers to keep going, to produce faster, to beat deadlines. The message was clear: every hour of work saved lives. And in the Pacific, pilots saw the results of that effort each time they landed at a base and found new planes waiting. For the Japanese, this was a mystery at first, then a source of fear. Their high command had underestimated the industrial power of their enemy. They had expected a contest between warriors, fought through skill and courage. Instead, they faced a machine that could replace its losses as fast as they were inflicted. The cultural gap between the two nations became more visible with each passing month. Japan valued precision and tradition. America valued speed and quantity. The Japanese commanders were shocked to see how effective the American system was in practice. What they once saw as crude mass production turned out to be a decisive weapon. For the pilots in the air, this realization came in the form of endless waves of opponents. No matter how bravely they fought, the enemy's numbers never seemed to diminish. Slowly, the war became less about tactics and more about survival. And as the sky filled with new American planes, the Japanese pilots understood they were fighting not just men, but an entire industrial nation whose reach seemed without limit. As 1942 drew to a close, the full weight of America's industrial power began to show itself in the Pacific. The Japanese Navy had hoped Midway would weaken the Americans enough to buy them time to consolidate their gains. Instead, it marked the start of a new phase in the war, one defined by relentless pressure and an enemy that seemed to grow stronger each month. Japan could not match the rate at which the United States replaced planes, ships, and men. Their factories were small, their supply lines fragile, and their resources limited. Every aircraft they lost took weeks or months to replace. When a pilot was killed, his absence created a hole that was difficult to fill. By contrast, the Americans were producing new aircraft on an almost unimaginable scale. By 1943, the numbers told the story with brutal clarity. The U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were receiving over 6,000 new planes each month. Japan managed only about 600. For every Japanese plane built, 10 American planes took to the skies. This imbalance shaped the course of the war. In the early months, battles between the two sides had been roughly even. Japanese pilots, well-trained and experienced, held an edge in skill and tactics. Their planes were fast, agile, and deadly. At Coral Sea and even Midway, they proved they could fight on equal terms. But skill could not make up for losses that were never replaced. Each time a Japanese ace was shot down, his squadron grew weaker. Each time a carrier's air group was destroyed, the fleet's striking power shrank. The Americans faced losses too, but their factories and training programs erased those losses almost as soon as they occurred. A destroyed fighter squadron could be replaced in days. A new class of carriers, like the Essex class, began to arrive at a steady pace, each one carrying more planes and pilots than the last. For American commanders, this meant they could keep pressing forward. There was no need to hold back, no need to fight cautiously. If a mission failed, another could be launched almost immediately with fresh men and machines. The Guadalcanal campaign was the first clear test of this new reality. When U.S. Marines landed on the island in August 1942, the Japanese responded with fierce counterattacks. Their goal was to retake the airfield, Henderson Field, which allowed the Americans to control the surrounding seas. In the first weeks, the fighting was balanced. Japanese planes flew from distant bases to strike at Guadalcanal, while American planes operated from Henderson and nearby carriers. But as the weeks turned into months, the difference in supply began to tell. Japanese planes were lost at a rate they could not replace. Pilots flew mission after mission with little rest, knowing there were no reserves to relieve them. Fuel shortages forced commanders to limit flight operations. Maintenance crews lacked spare parts, so damaged planes were often stripped for components just to keep a few flying. The Americans, by contrast, rotated in fresh squadrons. Replacement planes arrived regularly, flown straight into combat zones from nearby islands or shipped partially assembled and completed on-site. Even when they suffered heavy losses, the runways at Henderson Field never stayed empty for long. This constant flow of reinforcements gave the Americans a steady offensive capability. Day by day, the Japanese found themselves outnumbered. By early 1943, their air units around Guadalcanal were so depleted that they could no longer challenge American control of the skies. The defeat at Guadalcanal was a blow from which Japan never recovered. It marked the end of their ability to conduct large-scale offensive operations. From that point on, they were on the defensive, forced to react to American advances rather than initiate their own. The production imbalance only grew wider. As 1943 progressed, the U.S. war machine shifted into an even higher gear. New aircraft types like the F-6F Hellcat and the SB-2C Helldiver rolled off assembly lines in vast numbers. Pilots trained on these new planes in huge schools across the United States, graduating in classes of hundreds. When they reached the front, they joined fleets that were larger and better equipped than ever before. For Japanese forces, the situation was dire. Their training programs were rushed and under-resourced. New pilots arrived with only a fraction of the experience needed to survive in combat. Many were sent into battle after just a few weeks of instruction, flying against veteran American squadrons backed by overwhelming numerical superiority. Losses mounted and morale sank. This disparity reached its peak during the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944. By then, the United States had a massive fleet of carriers and planes. When Japanese forces attempted to challenge them, they were met by wave after wave of American fighters. The result was a one-sided slaughter known to U.S. pilots as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. In a single day, Japanese naval aviation was effectively destroyed. More than 600 planes were lost, along with many of the remaining experienced pilots. The battle was decisive not because of tactics alone, but because of what it represented. The Americans could afford to replace every plane they lost and continue the fight. The Japanese could not. Their last major offensive air action had ended in disaster, and there was no path to recovery. From that point forward, Japan's navy fought without a true air arm, relying on desperate measures like kamikaze attacks to slow the American advance. The war in the Pacific had become a war of attrition, and only one side had the resources to sustain it. American carriers roamed the ocean, launching constant strikes against enemy positions. Land bases expanded across newly captured islands, each one stocked with fresh squadrons. Logistics ships kept the entire system supplied, ensuring that no unit ever ran short of fuel, ammunition, or parts. For the Japanese, every battle was a gamble they could not afford to lose. Their shrinking pool of planes and pilots forced them into defensive positions. Commanders had to decide which bases to defend and which to abandon, knowing they lacked the strength to hold them all. By late 1944, the imbalance was overwhelming. The Pacific skies belonged to the Americans. Japan's early war victories, built on superior skill and daring tactics, had been erased by the sheer scale of America's industrial power. The war was no longer a contest of strategy alone. It had become a matter of numbers, and those numbers favored the United States at every level. When the war in the Pacific finally ended, the lessons from those years of struggle were plain to see. The decisive factor had not been a single battle or even a brilliant strategy. It had been the ability of one nation to produce and deliver overwhelming amounts of war material while another could not. The victory had been forged not only in the skies and on the seas, but also in the factories, shipyards, and supply depots that worked without pause thousands of miles from the front lines. The story of Midway and its aftermath became an enduring case study in how modern wars are fought and won. Japan's early successes had been built on skill, daring, and careful preparation. Their pilots were among the best in the world at the start of the war. Their ships and planes were well designed, the product of meticulous craftsmanship. But these strengths were limited by the realities of industrial capacity. Japan could not replace what it lost at the rate the war demanded. Once its pool of experienced pilots and its reserve of ships began to shrink, no amount of bravery or precision could close the gap. The United States fought a different kind of war. From the start, its leaders understood that production and logistics were as important as tactics. They built a system that turned raw materials into finished weapons at a speed no other nation could match. Oil from Texas, steel from Pittsburgh, and aluminum from the Pacific Northwest were transformed into bombers, carriers, and tanks. Each part of the country played a role. Railroads moved goods to ports, where they were loaded onto cargo ships and sent across oceans. When those ships reached forward bases, the supplies were organized and distributed so that units at the front never ran dry. This approach required planning on a massive scale. Commanders in the field had to think not just about where to fight, but also how to keep their forces supplied. For every plane in the sky, there were countless workers behind it. Factory crews who built it, mechanics who maintained it, sailors who shipped it, and quartermasters who tracked every spare part. The success of American forces in the Pacific came from this web of effort. It was a victory built on systems, not just individuals. After the war, military planners studied these lessons carefully. During the early years of the Cold War, the United States shaped its strategy around the idea of mass mobilization. The belief was that any future conflict with a major power would require the same ability to produce weapons and supplies at scale. This thinking influenced everything from the layout of factories to the way bases were constructed. Stockpiles of equipment were maintained so that production could be ramped up quickly if needed. Even the design of new aircraft and ships took logistics into account. They had to be built, maintained, and replaced efficiently. The war also left a deep mark on Japan. In the immediate aftermath, the country faced devastation. Cities lay in ruins, its military was dismantled, and its industries were shattered. Yet, in the years that followed, Japanese leaders began to rebuild. They looked closely at what the Americans had done and recognized the power of standardization and mass production. Companies like Toyota and Mitsubishi shifted from old methods of craftsmanship to new systems that focused on efficiency and output. What had once been seen as crude or impersonal became a model for rebuilding a modern economy. Toyota, in particular, studied the idea of assembly lines and continuous production. Over time, they developed techniques that improved on the American model. These methods would later become known worldwide as the Toyota production system, influencing industries far beyond Japan. The same principles that had once allowed America to overwhelm Japan in war now helped Japan rise again in peace. Mitsubishi, which had built aircraft during the war, also turned to civilian production with a new understanding of scale and process. Factories that had once produced fighters like the Zero were retooled to build cars, trucks, and heavy equipment. The shift was dramatic, but it was rooted in the lessons learned during those desperate war years. By embracing mass production, Japan transformed itself from a defeated nation into an economic powerhouse. The military world did not forget those lessons either. In academies and war colleges around the world, the Battle of Midway and the campaigns that followed are still studied today. The focus is not only on tactics but also on the logistics that made those tactics possible. Students learn how a constant flow of supplies can turn the tide of war, and how failing to protect that flow can doom even the strongest army. Midway is used as an example of what happens when two different systems clash. On one side was a force that relied on precision and elite skill but lacked depth. On the other was a force that could take losses and recover almost instantly. The Japanese Navy fought bravely, but each defeat cut deeper than the last. The Americans absorbed defeat and kept coming back stronger. Modern militaries apply these lessons in their planning. They think about how to move fuel, food, and ammunition as much as how to fight battles. Logistics is treated as a weapon, one that can decide the outcome before the first shot is fired. The U.S. military, in particular, invests heavily in transport ships, cargo planes, and supply chains. These are the unseen elements of power, less dramatic than a carrier strike group or a squadron of bombers, but just as important. In today's world, where conflicts can erupt far from home, these principles remain vital. The Pacific campaigns of World War II showed that a nation's ability to project force depends on what happens behind the front lines. Midway was more than a naval battle. It was a test of endurance between two systems. When Japanese pilots saw new American planes filling the skies only days after massive losses, they were witnessing the future of warfare. It was a future shaped not just by courage or strategy, but by factories, workers, and the relentless movement of supplies across a vast ocean. The legacy of that moment reaches into the present. The same factories and processes that once built warplanes now produce goods for civilian life. The supply networks developed to fight a global war laid the groundwork for modern trade and transportation. And the story of Midway continues to be told, not only as a tale of bravery and sacrifice, but also as a lesson in how nations prepare for the challenges of war and peace.